Welcome to the Writing Instruction video series. I'm Tiffany Griffith, Director of Writing for the University of Evansville. This video is going to focus on coordination and subordination, or sentence combining. The content of this video will build on the previous video on parts of the sentence and sentences. So as a quick review, remember that we have a couple of different types of construction. Phrases, a phrase will have a subject or a verb, but not both, as in this example. Traipsing through the park. Traipsing is our verb, but we have no subject, so we don't know who was doing the traipsing. The other important construction to keep in mind is the clause. And there are a couple of different kinds of clauses. All clauses will have a subject and a verb, but the independent clause, also called a main clause or a complete sentence, is a complete sentence. There's a subject and a verb, and also a complete thought. For instance, Stuart tripped over the hedgehog. Tripped is our verb, Stuart is our subject. In addition, we know exactly where he tripped, over a hedgehog. The second kind of clause is a dependent or a subordinate clause. It differs from a main clause in that it cannot stand by itself. It isn't independent. There is a subject and a verb, but there's no complete thought. In many cases, there will be some sort of signal word or phrase to let the reader know that the clause is dependent. You might have a subordinating conjunction, such as so that, because, when, while. So let's take a look at an example of this. While he was traipsing through the park. We have a subject, he, we have a verb, was traipsing, but the while creates a problem. While lets us know that this sentence isn't a sentence. It's in fact a dependent clause. So let's give it an independent clause so that the whole thing makes sense. While Stuart was traipsing through the park, he tripped over a hedgehog. He is our subject, tripped is our verb, and the dependent clause at the beginning of this complete sentence, while Stuart was traipsing through the park, gives us a little bit of additional information and lets us know when and where Stuart was when he tripped over this notorious hedgehog. Coordination and subordination are good ways to combine or join sentences or clauses. This is an excellent way to add variety and interest to your writing to keep the reader as well as yourself engaged as you go. So, as an example, which is more interesting? Stuart was walking through the park. He tripped over a hedgehog. Or a coordinated version of these two independent clauses. Stuart was walking through the park and he tripped over a hedgehog. Yet another example that's probably going to be more interesting than the first one is an instance of subordination. We've made one of the clauses dependent. While Stuart was walking through the park, he tripped over a hedgehog. In addition to adding interest and variety to your writing, sentence combining, subordination, and coordination can also be good ways to improve clarity. The way you combine sentences signals the relationship between the clauses to the reader. So again, it can help clarity, it can signal relationships, and it provides interest. So let's stop and take a look at coordination and subordination and see them in action. Coordination, or coordinating two main clauses, is linking them together, joining two complete sentences, and they'll still remain complete sentences. And there are 4 ways to do this. Notice that putting a period in isn't one of them because that just leaves you with 2 separate sentences that aren't coordinated or combined. Again, there are 4 ways to coordinate 2 independent clauses. The first is using a comma and a coordinating conjunction. Your coordinating conjunctions will provide a useful acronym here, are your fanboys: for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. And different conjunctions communicate different relationships between ideas. For instance, look for the difference between these. Stuart tripped over a hedgehog, but he still enjoyed his walk in the park. Stuart tripped over a hedgehog, and he still enjoyed his walk in the park. Stuart tripped over a hedgehog, yet he still enjoyed his walk in the park. Now notice that yet and but convey similar meanings, and shows simply joining. And it's important to choose your conjunctions carefully, just as you always want to be careful with word choice, because not every conjunction is going to work equally well or even make sense at all in every situation. Stuart tripped over a hedgehog, so he still enjoyed his walk in the park. Arguably, this could work. Maybe the fact that he tripped over the hedgehog is what really made Stuart enjoy that walk, but it seems sort of unlikely. Stuart tripped over a hedgehog, for he still enjoyed his walk in the park. This seems to establish a problematic causal relationship, and for doesn't really make sense here. So again, choose your wording carefully to accurately convey your meaning and the relationships between the two clauses that you're joining. The second way to join two complete sentences is to use a semicolon, a conjunctive adverb, and a comma. Now you may be asking, what exactly is a conjunctive adverb? Conjunctive adverbs are words like however, nevertheless, nonetheless, therefore, furthermore, otherwise, thus, etc. However is probably the most commonly used example of this particular kind of word. So you can use a semicolon with a conjunctive adverb followed by a comma, and you have to have all three components in order to make this coordination work. Stuart tripped over a hedgehog. However, he still enjoyed his walk in the park. Stuart tripped over a hedgehog. Nevertheless, he still enjoyed his walk in the park. Just as with the coordinating conjunctions, not every conjunctive adverb is going to work in every situation, and some of them really just aren't going to make that much sense. For instance, Stuart tripped over a hedgehog. Therefore, he still enjoyed his walk in the park. Again, maybe walking through the park and tripping over the hedgehog is what really made Stuart's day, but it's sort of a problematic connection. So, be careful with your word choice. A third way to coordinate or join two complete sentences is to use the semicolon. Typically, you're going to use a semicolon when there's a second independent clause containing commas or a lot of punctuation, particularly really, really close to where that break is between your two complete sentences. Semicolon shows a relationship, a pretty close relationship between the two clauses, but you're probably going to want to use semicolons sparingly, just a handful in any given essay. Let's take a look at an example. Stuart was embarrassed. All of the children saw him fall after he tripped over the hedgehog. Again, the semicolon indicates a relationship between these two clauses. Stuart was embarrassed. The second independent clause, all of the children saw him fall after he tripped over the hedgehog, lets the reader know why he was embarrassed. So, semicolons can be used in order to put together two complete sentences, but it shows a close relationship, and it's probably not going to be used very frequently. The final way to join or coordinate two complete sentences is the colon. And if a semicolon is to be used infrequently or sparingly, the colon is going to be used rarely. I sometimes refer to the colon in the instance of coordinating sentences as "don't try this at home" punctuation, because it's a fairly specific type of coordinating device. Frequently, or most frequently, we're going to use colons in writing to introduce lists or sometimes to set off a quotation. It's not as frequently used to join sentences. So again, you're going to use this device rarely. Colons, not unlike the semicolon, introduce a second independent clause that explains or expands on the first independent clause. But a colon shows a much closer relationship between the two clauses than does the semicolon. Usually, this is going to be a causal relationship. So let's take a look at an example. Stuart was ashamed. His breath smelled of hedgehogs. In this case, the relationship is causal, why Stuart was ashamed. But the reader has to infer a little bit of information here. The reader has to infer or guess or assume why it is that Stuart's breath smells of hedgehog. We're not going to spell this out here. So, typically, you can use a colon. You could use a colon anywhere you would use a semicolon. But the semicolon is slightly more pedestrian. It just says or tells something, whereas a colon sort of smacks you upside the head and grabs your lapels and says, look at this relationship between these two ideas. Again, use it sparingly. And because the colon is used so infrequently, it stands out more, and it's kind of a flashier sort of coordinating device. It begs for attention. It insists upon itself, in a way. The semicolon is more casual. So let's take another look at an example with a colon. Tim went to prison. He had murdered his mother. Again, you could, in this case, use a semicolon, but it's much too casual. This is a fairly important, sort of shocking situation, and the connection, you're inferring a little bit, but it's explained, but this is a fairly drastic situation. You could use a colon effectively in the following example. Stuart bought apples at the store. He liked fruit. But this is much too boring a sentence. with a fairly plain and uninteresting connection or relationship between the two ideas. The colon says that the relationship itself is important, and again, it really draws attention to that relationship. So use the colon with caution. Use it rarely. Now that we've talked about coordination, or joining two independent clauses, let's take a look at subordination. Subordination is joining one or more independent clause or clauses with one or more dependent clauses. Essentially, if you're subordinating, you're making a complete sentence into a dependent or subordinate clause, which must then be attached to a complete sentence because, as we've established, dependent clauses cannot stand on their own. Subordinate clauses, again, have a subject and a verb, but they express no complete thought, and there might be some sort of signal word or phrase, such as a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun, that signals to you and to the reader that what follows is not going to be a complete sentence. So let's look at a couple of these ways that you can subordinate. Again, some dependent clauses may contain a subordinating conjunction. A subordinating conjunction is a word like because, though, so that, in order to, or after. If you refer to a good handbook, you'll be able to find a much more complete list of subordinating conjunctions. Much like their cousins, the coordinating conjunctions, subordinating conjunctions indicate the relationship between clauses, in this case between an independent and a dependent clause. Again, a subordinating conjunction is going to indicate that the clause that comes after it cannot stand on its own, and it essentially makes that clause dependent. For example, while he enjoyed his walk through the park, Stuart kept an eye out for hedgehogs. We have an independent clause here. Stuart kept an eye out for hedgehogs, and then a dependent clause at the beginning of the sentence that introduces the sentence and lets us know what Stuart was doing when he kept an eye out for the hedgehogs while he enjoyed his walk through the park. You can also put a dependent clause after an independent clause. Stuart hurried home after he tripped over the hedgehog. Again, this dependent clause gives us a little bit more information about the independent clause. It lets us know when exactly Stuart went home. And finally, Stuart was embarrassed because everyone saw him fall. The second dependent clause here, the second clause is dependent because everyone saw him fall. Notice we have a subject, everyone, and a verb, saw, but this word because indicates that everything after it is dependent and can't stand on its own. And this also gives us a causal relationship. We know why Stuart was embarrassed. Be sure that you don't confuse prepositions such as in, before, from, or beside with subordinating conjunctions. For instance, Stuart tripped over the hedgehog in the park. And in this instance, we actually have two separate prepositional phrases. We have a subject and a verb. Stuart tripped. Over the hedgehog is a prepositional phrase that lets us know where Stuart tripped, how Stuart tripped. In the park is an additional prepositional phrase, and notice each of these phrases has a subject but no verb. In the park tells us where Stuart was when he tripped. Stuart was strolling beside the lake. Again, beside is a preposition, beside the lake is a prepositional phrase. We have a subject, lake, but no verb, and beside the lake lets us know where Stuart was strolling. In addition to the subordinating conjunction, there's another indicator that you might find that lets a reader know that what follows it is subordinate, and that would be a relative pronoun. Your relative pronouns are that, which, who, whose, and whom. Some examples of these. This video footage is proof that the hedgehog tripped Stuart on purpose. We have our independent clause. This video footage is proof. The dependent clause, again, provides us additional information. What is it proof of? That the hedgehog tripped Stuart on purpose. Again, if you eliminate that, this relative pronoun, you could say the hedgehog tripped Stuart on purpose and have a complete sentence. But the relative pronoun is signaling that what follows it is subordinate. The hedgehog which Stuart tripped over was uninjured. In this case, which Stuart tripped over, subordinated clause with the relative pronoun which that provides additional information about the hedgehog. Which hedgehog? the one that Stuart tripped over. This particular hedgehog was uninjured. As a quick note on punctuating when you're subordinating, if you have an independent clause followed by a dependent clause, there's no need whatsoever to have punctuation between those two. If, however, you reverse the order, if you have the dependent clause at the beginning of the sentence, you're going to want to use a comma to set the dependent clause off from the following independent clause. For instance, while he enjoyed his walk through the park, Stuart kept an eye out for hedgehogs. The complete sentence, Stuart kept an eye out for hedgehogs. The introductory dependent clause gives us some information about when Stuart was keeping an eye out for hedgehogs, while he enjoyed his walk through the park. Beginning of the sentence, dependent clause, set it off with a comma. If, as in the second example, the dependent clause follows the independent clause, there's no need for the comma. Stuart was embarrassed because everyone saw him fall. Again, the dependent clause tells us why Stuart was embarrassed. Let's take a quick look at a couple of examples from student papers. She's thinking that if she doesn't find this pen, then her streak of good grades is going to go down the tube, though she isn't going to exactly fail the test if she doesn't have that one pen. Here, the word though is a subordinating conjunction, which tips the reader off that everything after it is a dependent clause and can't stand by itself. Since we have this dependent clause, the easiest way to fix this problem is to eliminate the period and simply join the dependent clause to the previous independent clause. And we have, again, this causal relationship. In a paper about the novel Frankenstein, a student writes, "He terrorized the Bavarian countryside because he was mistreated by the scientist who created him and by society as a whole." Notice that in this case, again, you have a dependent clause after an independent clause, so you wouldn't need the comma in this case. The student has included a comma, so you can simply delete it, and the problem is fixed. Now that we've discussed coordination and subordination, let's take a look at sentence classification, or various types of sentences. You may be asking yourself, why? Why do we need to look at sentence classifications? It's helpful to examine different types of sentences so that we have a common language to talk about coordination and subordination, and also to talk about various comma errors, which we'll be addressing in a later video. Sentences can be classified by the number and types of clauses that they contain. And again, we do this so that we can talk precisely about how to improve simplistic writing, how to coordinate things, how you might want to alter sentences and coordinate and subordinate. So there are 4 main types of sentences. The first is the simple sentence. A simple sentence is fairly simple. It has one independent clause. Stuart strolled through the park. Subject, verb, complete thought. Now, you might have a phrase attached and still have a simple sentence because you're not adding any other clauses. So you might say, looking for hedgehogs, Stuart strolled through the park. The second type of sentence is a compound sentence. And a compound sentence simply means that you're joining together 2 complete sentences, 2 independent clauses. This compound sentence is going to be created by coordination, whether you're using a comma and a coordinating conjunction, a semicolon, a conjunctive adverb and a comma, a semicolon, or a colon. For instance, Stuart walked through the park and he tripped over a hedgehog. One complete sentence, Stuart walked through the park. Second complete sentence, he tripped over a hedgehog. The third type of sentence is a complex sentence. And you have a complex sentence when you have one independent clause joined with one or more dependent clauses. You're going to create a complex sentence through subordination. For example, while he was strolling in the park, Stuart tripped over a hedgehog. Stuart tripped over a hedgehog is our independent clause, and the introductory clause is dependent while he was strolling in the park. The final sentence type combines the middle 2. The final sentence type is the compound complex sentence, which means there are 2 or more independent clauses and at least 1, sometimes more, dependent clauses. And you create a compound complex sentence by using both coordination and subordination. Let's look at an example. While he was strolling through the park, Stuart tripped over a hedgehog. Therefore, he was very embarrassed. Our coordinating device is the semicolon, conjunctive adverb, and a comma. He was very embarrassed is our second independent clause. The first independent clause, Stuart tripped over a hedgehog, also has a subordinate element, an introductory dependent clause, while he was strolling through the park. Now, it's important to remember that the goals of coordination and subordination are to demonstrate relationships between clauses, to improve clarity, and to add variety and interest to your writing. So to recap, coordination joins two complete sentences using a comma plus a conjunction, a semicolon plus a conjunctive adverb plus a comma, using just a semicolon. Again, this one's not going to be used very often, fairly infrequently. And finally, the least often used method for coordinating sentences is the colon. It's going to be used very rarely, and it's going to show really, really close relationships, usually causal relationships, that the author really wants to draw the reader's attention to. Subordination joins two clauses by making one of the clauses dependent rather than independent. And we subordinate through the use often of a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun. Finally, we have our various sentence classifications. And the sentence classifications are going to be important because they give us a common language to talk about coordination and subordination and to talk about comma errors, which we'll be discussing in a later video. You have four key kinds of sentence classifications. A simple sentence simply has one independent clause. A compound sentence coordinates two independent clauses. A complex sentence uses subordination and involves one independent clause and one or possibly more dependent clauses. A compound complex sentence uses coordination and subordination and joins at least two independent clauses with one or more dependent clauses. If you have any questions about coordination or subordination, or want to practice sentence combining and get a clearer sense of how you can effectively use it in your own writing, we would be happy to work with you at the Writing Center.